Great. Well, welcome everyone to today's special event featuring Tei Yamashita, author of Sansei and Sensibility. I'm Susie Wampler, Regional Coordinator for Jasmine Southwest here in Los Angeles. And please, again, if you haven't let us know where you're tuning in from, let us know in the chat box. Karen's talk will be followed by a Q&A session. Please, again, enter your questions in the chat box, starting with the word question at the beginning of the line, make it easier for me to find at the end. Before we start, I want to thank all of our wonderful donors who have really made these our series of Zoom events possible to offer for free, which has been a wonderful thing, which we're really grateful for, all of you. We've had so many generous donors, especially want to thank Claire and Bob Alante, who have been our underwriting sponsors for the full year. And I also want to let you know about a few upcoming events. We have April 24th, Kimberly Alexander, who's the author of Treasures Afoot, Shoe Stories from the Georgian Era, will be our guest. On May 15th, we have USC Professor of Dramatic Arts, Melinda Finberg, who is going to talk to us about Austen family theatricals, which is perfect for this year of Jane Austen and the arts. And June 19th, we have Deborah Nadoolman-Landis, who will be leading a moderated Q&A on costuming Regency era adaptations. And Landis is the founding director of the David C. Copley Center for Costume Design at UCLA. She's a two-term past president of the Costume Designers Guild, and she will moderate a conversation with some of her costume designer colleagues, including Ellen Mirajnik, costumer for Bridgerton. So we're very excited about that. You'll be getting more announcements about that and registration in the next few weeks. So we hope you can join us. And now it is my very great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Tei Yamashita. She is the author of 7 books, including I, Hotel, a National Book Award finalist, Tropic of Orange, Through the Arc of the Rainforest, and Letters to Memory. Her most recent book, Sansei and Sensibility, is the subject of today's event. Karen is a recipient of many awards, including the John Dos Passos Prize for Literature in 2018. She is also Professor Emerita of Creative Writing and Literature at the University of California, Santa Cruz. And now, with no further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce Karen. Thank you, Karen. If you can unmute yourself and start, that would be wonderful.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much. Thank you, Susan Wampler, and thank you to the Jane Austen Society. I guess it's Jasmine Southwest. Thank you for your invitation. I'm really honored to be here. I'm very nervous too. All right. What I want to do here is I'm going to share the screen, and I'll show you a keynote that I made for all of you. All right. Does that work? All right. So first of all, an explanation about the title. It's Sansei and Sensibility. And as you can see, sense has been replaced by Sansei. I know that doesn't make sense, but let me explain. So to be clear, it's not Sensei, which means teacher, but Sansei, which means 3rd generation Japanese immigrant descendant. So if you know how to count in Japanese, you can follow the number logic, ichi, ni, sanshi, go, etc. Somewhere in the middle of the book, you can find a timeline in which you will note that the Nisei were the greatest generation and the Sansei, well, were boomers. So in case you're wondering about the dates, my writer friend and bona fide Sansei, Naomi Hirahara, meticulously fact-checked everything. And also Naomi is a wonderful writer of mysteries, so check her out. Now, this book came about not because I had read or I really knew anything about Jane Austen or her novels or the time period of her writing. Everything I knew about Jane Austen was because of my sister, Jane Tomei, who is not only named Jane, but she is the Janeite of our family. And everything I gleaned about Jane Austen was by a kind of osmosis. Watching movies together, watching my sister plan and sew her Regency gowns, following her involvement in Jane Austen conferences and meetings, and being forced to vote for Pride and Prejudice for the PBS Great American Top 100 Reads. And if I recall, we were asked to vote often and as many times as we liked and every day. And I don't know what you think, but I thought there was something fishy about that. Considering that I had taught literature and I was a literature major, not having read Jane Austen sounds pretty dumb. But as I explain, or rather apologize in the book, it was about time to read Jane Austen. I bought the big book, the complete novels of Jane Austen with an introduction by Karen Joy Fowler. Karen Joy is a friend and writer who taught for us at UC Santa Cruz and who also lives in Santa Cruz. And Karen Joy is known for her science fiction and speculative fiction writing. So if Karen could enjoy and could write science fiction and also read Jane Austen, I realized I was missing out. And besides, reading Jane Austen could also be a bonding thing with my sister. In reading Austen's novels, I was trying, I think, to understand my sister, to find out why she loved reading these novels, how she could read them over and over again, and then go on to read everything about them, historic and academic, social and cultural, plus every sort of fan fiction based on these novels. So, okay, I admit I was a bit jealous, but why the obsession? So this is what I discovered. Jane Austen has a biting tongue. Regency dress is intoxicating. Class difference is sexy and the spice of romance. Being rich is a handsome problem. Sexual partnership, AKA sometimes marriage, is the unresolved feminist conundrum. And finally, people of color too want to go to the ball. So when Susie Wampler, through my sister, asked if I would do a Zoom for your Jane Austen Society, you can imagine the complexity of my feelings. Triumph, finally I get in the club. Embarrassment, good grief, I'm a fake. And anxiety, what could I possibly have to say to real Janeites? But it's true, I need to come clean. I need to take responsibility for writing this book, even though I mostly blame it all on my sister. I have finally come to think that today might be a good opportunity. So let me explain. This book is divided into two parts. Part one is Sansei, and it's a collection of previously published stories and essays. And part two, Sensibility.
We can't hear you.
You can't hear me? Can you hear me?
I can hear, I think most of
I
us can hear
can.
you. If anybody, let me just say, if anybody can't hear now, we are recording. It will be on, the video will be up on our YouTube channel. So if you miss anything, you'll be able to catch up. So, but I think most of us are hearing just fine. So sorry about that, Karen.
Yeah, I can hear.
Okay, good. So in part two.
I can hear you again. I can hear you now.
Oh, good, good. Maybe I talk louder. Part two is Sensibility, and it's a collection of stories based on Jane Austen's novels, one story for each novel. So up until now, I have been giving readings and lectures on the first half of this book. So perhaps today I can talk to an understanding audience more freely about the second half. Now, as I read Austen's novels one by one, I began to think about and to remember my sister and me growing up Sansei, or third generation Japanese American, in LA, Southern California. I thought about this because Austen's descriptions of society are enclosed and tightly knit, where everyone knows and gossips over the business of others. where slight differences are always noticed, where smart kids go to hide from notice in books. The closed community and social network in which we grew up could be stifling and provincial, but also safe. And there were reasons for why it existed. I'm going to read from an essay I wrote for the Guernica magazine, and I'll just read a few of the first paragraphs. My sister and I grew up in a series of Japanese American bubbles in the 1950s and 60s that shaped our Sansei lives in Los Angeles from elementary to high school, each bubble bursting into another. By bubble, I mean a protective community space of Japanese Americans who didn't have to explain to each other who they were or how they got there, didn't have to explain the war, that they'd been imprisoned in camps, exiled non-alien citizens, and returned to the West Coast to try to resume their American lives. The bubble was never an easy space. Its safe containment also harbored shame, antagonisms, censures, provincialism, but it was still home. We stayed in this bubble even as we moved through 3 Los Angeles neighborhoods confined by racial covenants at the margins of post-war social mobility. So, Fifth Avenue, Los Angeles. In 1952, my parents were a young couple with a 1-year-old baby, me, arriving from Oakland. My father called to pastor the Japanese American Centenary Methodist Church, and this is the church in the day. It was near Normandy Avenue and Jefferson Boulevard in central Los Angeles. That church, founded in 1896, became in the post-war years part of a social safety network for returning Japanese. My parents moved into the church parsonage, located about 1.5 miles from the church on Fifth Avenue. The following year, my sister was born. The church and the Fifth Avenue parsonage were the center around which our early lives radiated. The surrounding neighborhood was home mostly to African American and Japanese American families. It was part of a midriff swath of LA that extended from Boyle Heights through downtown and Little Tokyo, crossing USC, traveling down Jefferson Boulevard and abutting itself against the Baldwin Hills. It was where we were allowed to live and to buy homes. It was where the Japanese community and young Nisei families returned to jumpstart our lives. In this racial geography, my sister and I had no idea. So I began to think about social similarities between Jane Austen's community and ours. Of course, the society that Jane Austen describes is incredibly wealthy. And we lived in the urban inner city of working and lower middle class folks. But in each Austen novel, there were counters that I could draw from that felt familiar. Maybe I thought if I could remember the way we were in those days, I could figure out the meaning of Jane Austen to my sister. And I could also add a missing element in Austen's novels, race. So I thought I would share with you what I learned and how I wrote each story. First off, there is a cheat sheet. What I want to do is to share with you the intersections of Jane Austen's world with our Sansei world of post-war Japanese American communities in Southern California. Each of these stories begins with the Japanese evocation, mukashi, mukashi, meaning in former times or a long time ago, or to invoke an old folk tale, once upon a time. Okay, we're Sansei are not that old, but if you got the COVID vaccine twice already, like I have, chances are you are probably over 65. And my grandkids think that's pretty old. So let's begin with Sense and Sensibility. And or my version, shikataganai and mottainai. In the JA or Japanese American community in our day, some of the most successful and prominent people were the optometrists. You figure that Japanese all have bad eyes, so it's a win-win situation. A lot of bad eyes and excellent optometrists. In my story, the Dashwood family are the Dashi Moris. And Dr. John Dashi Mori Jr. is a successful optometrist. He is married to Fan Fan, and his two dependent high school sisters are Eleanor and Mary Ann Dashi Mori. In tune with Austen's title, Sense and Sensibility, I thought about keywords that Japanese Americans are all familiar with that mark our social attitudes, shikataganai and mottainai. Shikataganai literally means it can't be helped. Something like, don't cry over spilled milk. In other words, in an impossible situation, forget it, move on. Mottainai means don't waste, to take care of, or to make use of, or to finish everything, to scrape up the last bits at the bottom of a jar. These phrases became significant when Japanese Americans on the Pacific coast were sent away to internment camps to be imprisoned as citizen enemies during World War II. Shikataganai, it couldn't be helped. Move on with our lives, but also how to make use of lives lost and lost time. Mottainai, what a waste. However you read these stories as based in Austen's plots and characters, central to my telling is the post-war. The return of Japanese Americans to the West Coast from internment camps and the war. The desire of the Nisei generation to start their lives over again as Americans. I asked my niece, Lucy Asako Bolts, and she's my sister's daughter, this really is a family event, to create some cartoons for this presentation based on her reading of these stories. So this story begins. Mukashi, mukashi, as they used to say in our little world of tea houses and dainty gardens of pine bonsai and azalea, dappled in puffy mounds of lime green dichondra, lacquered bridges expanding serene ponds of fat polka dot koi resting in the shadows of water lilies, leaning red maple and purple wisteria, the click-clack of bamboo on rock. The clatter of geta over wood and the swishing of silk were the happy undertones of the chatter of two young Sansei sisters who appeared on the bridge to scatter round pellets of koi food from a small hand-woven basket. A flutter of banana yellow butterflies seemed to swirl from their bright kimono and scatter over the pond, when suddenly a gigantic white koi broke the surface, its large albino lips and gullet opening and flaring, and handily gulped down the largest of the butterflies. Though perhaps only the impudent size of a baby canary. The sisters watch the delicate wings fold and crush, and the koi's pink eye blink and disappear. "Oh," said Mary Ann, the younger of the two Dashimori sisters, "you've seen it for yourself. He's done it again." She pouted and banged her geta into the bridge, the sudden noise sending the koi below to scatter. "I'm telling John tonight to catch that old monster and serve him up for sashimi." Moving on to Pride and Prejudice, or my version, Giri and Gaman. The big deal about Pride and Prejudice is, well, Mr. Darcy. But my reading of Mr. Darcy is that he doesn't say anything for pages and pages, and then finally, when pushed to declare his love, he speaks for paragraphs. We only know Darcy from his slights and silence, but then I thought about all those cute Sansei boys who were socially inept, inarticulate, boring, and hopelessly shy. But secretly, these guys were amazing and powerful. They were samurai and kung fu masters. Once again, in keeping with Austen's title, Pride and Prejudice, I chose two words in the Japanese American lexicon that want to define or self-define us. Again, these words are attached to wartime internment, to ideas of duty, to family and country, and the will to persevere during difficult times. But just as Austen complicates her storytelling, the ideas of pride and prejudice, by speaking through the lives of young women, I here too want to complicate the ideas of duty and perseverance, as young women are called to active citizenship. As you know, the 14th Amendment of the Constitution guarantees the equal rights of all persons in America. However, wartime imprisonment without due process of law deprived these children of their life and liberty. A few other bits of information in my version of Pride and Prejudice. It's set in a public high school in the 1960s. The Benihana daughters all attend this high school. Mrs. Benihana is president of the PTA, and Miss Borg is the high school principal, and the school librarian is Mr. Collins. On the night of the prom, Mr. Benihana came up from his basement to find his wife and daughters in a titter of pastel chiffon and nylons and satin, pointed heels and hairspray. He greeted each of the young men, all awkward in stiff suits and ties, who came to take his daughters away. When everyone seemed to have disappeared and left the house in peaceful calm, Mr. Benihana saw Lizzie on the sofa with a book. "What are you doing here?" "What about that Darcy kid whose dad is always talking about serving the 442nd? "Oh, he took his sister to the prom." "Oh yeah?" Mr. Benihana seemed to think about this, but said nothing. "Hey, let's go to a movie," he offered. "I heard about it on the radio." "The Graduate. Sounds real," he added, looking at the tossed book on the sofa. "Hey, forget Salinger." Now, this might be obvious. Monterey Park stands for Mansfield Park. In the 1960s and 70s, well-to-do Chinese Americans, many relocating from Hong Kong, were able to afford nice houses and businesses in Monterey Park. The folks in Monterey Park weren't too happy about this and tried to pass an English-only law for signage, and I guess it didn't work out. I suppose you could say that Monterey Park got gentrified by well-to-do Chinese, and it seemed like a prosperous place to locate the Wuya Wada family, their 4 children, their pugs, and their poor relative, Fanny Rice. That's right, not Fanny Price, but Fanny Rice. It's really a bad joke. One other thing, I decided to switch roles and to make the mother, Tammy Wuya, a formidable figure and a tiger mother who has absolute notions of control over her children, their education, and their future. Guaranteed, Fanny Rice will be a star. One more thing about Monterey Park and its relationship to Mansfield Park. And I can't resist this because in the beginning, the only thing I'd read about Jane Austen was Edward Said's essay about Thomas Bertrand's plantation holdings in Antigua. In my version, the tiger mother, Tammy Wuya, is a Chinese entrepreneur who has made her great fortune exploiting Filipino laborers who make plastic toys and Bic lighters that sell like hotcakes during the Vietnam War to American GIs in her factory in the Philippines. Tammy wandered into her house, which had been transformed by low lighting, rotating strobes and lava lamps, and meandered through crowds of girls with thick makeup, exposed bosoms, and martini glasses, posturing haughtily and moving lasciviously to the live music pumping from the rock band playing on a platform on the far side of the pool. She could see Eddie on the guitar, random other kids on drums and bass, and Mary belting vocals into a handheld microphone modulated through a sound system Harry controlled on the other side. And through the glass doors, Tommy, dressed like Dracula, was lit up on an inside stage, placing a pug in a black box and tapping it with his magic wand. Fanny, looking up from the keyboards, was the first to see Tammy. Julie was barefoot, dancing precariously on the diving board over the deep end. And when Tammy screamed her recognizable scream, the shock tossed Julie into the pool. Splash. That, Fanny would remember, was the beginning of the end. The final blow to Tammy was to find Mariko in the garage in the middle of an intense and cheering crowd presiding over a table of blackjack. Now, Emma. Emma, for me, is my favorite read. Emma, I think, is a character study, and what the reader follows is her growth as a person. I read Emma as free-spirited, generously enthusiastic, bright, and charmingly naive. My Emma is Emma Moriuchi. And in case you're wondering, Mr. Knightley, older and more discerning, is in my story is George Kishi. As it turns out, Emmy was born in Manzanar, the internment camp in the southeastern side of California under the Sierra Nevadas. But this is a secret. It's never revealed to her until she is a teenager. In other words, Emmy has no knowledge of her past and the wartime internment of Japanese Americans. I think this was generally true of many Sansei. That is, the Nisei, our parents' generation, kept the knowledge of the war from their children to protect us from that stigma. It is from this knowledge that Emmy finally becomes gradually more aware and more politically involved. All Harriet ever talked about was guys. So Emmy suggested she might expand her horizons, that is, come to meetings. Emmy pulled a sheet of cookies from the oven, shoved a spatula under a soft cookie, and listened. You know Bob? Harriet asked. Bob Turi? Right. He asked me to marry him. Oh, well, congratulations. Emmy frowned at one cookie that had folded itself over. But I thought we were working on Phil or Frank. You haven't said yes or no yet. Harriet stuffed a warm cookie into her mouth and muttered through the dough. What do you think? You have doubts? I mean, why ask me? I'm never getting married. Never? Then Emmy said, let me ask you this. What are Bob's politics? In her coming of age, what Emmy learns about is a long history of anti-Asian immigration policies and laws, from the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882 and on, all fueled by racism and hate, which are used as precedents to justify the incarceration of honest and hardworking immigrant families. By Emmy's time in 1982, 100 years later, a young man named Vincent Chin was bludgeoned to death in Detroit and blamed for the layoffs of American auto workers because of competition from Japanese car makers. Today, 39 years later, sadly, we again see the same evil face of racist hate and blaming. I believe the turning point in Emma is a scene in which Emma openly ridicules Miss Spates. Similarly, my character, Emmy, brings her cohort of Sansei radicals to a church event to rebelliously denounce their parents' generation for their complicity in their own incarceration. My Miss Bates is Mrs. Essa, who hosts the church event to painful embarrassment. Also, I thought you'd like to see a photograph of those fierce Sansei women in the day. I paint Emmy as a pretty sweet woman. But really, we were a pretty rude bunch. Northanger Abbey is next. I got caught up in the idea of the Gothic in Northanger Abbey, and I began to remember the Goth moment in American youth culture. As it turns out, in Little Tokyo, there used to be a restaurant called the Atomic Cafe, named to remember the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The Atomic Cafe was opened in the post-war by Minoru and Ito Matoba. It was a diner serving hamburgers and noodles, egg foo young, and chop suey. In the late 80s, when Minoru became ill, his daughter, Nancy, took over the cafe, and she started dressing in punk, put up punk posters, played punk music, and this attracted a new crowd of youth. The Atomic Cafe was filled with punk kids in mohawks, piercings, safety pin earrings, and nose rings, black lipstick, etc.
I have a
Well, the Atomic Cafe was opened in the post-war by Minoru and Ito Matoba. It was a diner serving hamburgers and noodles, egg foo young, and chop suey. In the late 70s, when Minoru became ill, his daughter, Nancy, took over the cafe, and she started dressing in punk, put up punk posters, played punk music, and this attracted a new crowd of youth. The Atomic Cafe was filled with punk kids in mohawks and piercings, safety pin earrings and nose rings, black lipstick, etc. It is said that the Go-Go's, David Byrne and Sid Vicious, came to the Atomic Cafe to slurp chashu ramen. And Nancy was known in the day as Atomic Nancy, the kabuki punk girl. So that is the fictional setting of my Northanger Abbey, Japanese American Gothic. Kathy's eyes traversed the Hiroshima hostess, Bella, who sported a red hoppy coat over a leather skirt and fishnets, her hair ratted in every direction. Bella shook her finger at Mrs. Ishii. Too many sweets. Mrs. Ishii nodded back and forth like it was her fault. Bella, this is Kathy. Bella took a step back and glared appropriately through mascara and thick eyeliner, moist red lips articulating, how do you do? Emphasizing the do's. Kathy stumbled. Bella turned and left the table, yelling over the counter into the kitchen, Mama, guess who's here? A few more things about J.A. Gothic story. The three fathers in the story, Katsunoda, who is the general, Tosh Ozawa, Kathy's father, Nin Murata, the dying owner of the Hiroshima Cafe, were all Kibe. Now, Kibe means they were born in the United States, but sent to Japan to be educated. They were therefore bilingual and biculturally Japanese and American. Their personal story is that the three men were childhood friends going to school in Hiroshima, but upon returning to the United States, the war broke out. So Murata left California for Montana to avoid incarceration, and Katsunoda and Toshozawa were incarcerated with other Japanese Americans as enemy non-aliens. But their friendship ended because of their different answers to the loyalty questionnaire. All imprisoned Japanese in camp were required to answer this questionnaire. It would determine if you could leave to work outside of camp and or if you could serve in the US military. While many of the questions seemed innocuous or about contact with Japan and its traditions, two questions in particular, question 27 and question 28, about willingness to serve in the US military and forswearing any allegiance to the Japanese emperor, were confusing and divisive within the incarcerated communities. The answering of these two questions, yes, yes, or no, no, created rifts between families and between friends with hostile and traumatic divisions that resound to this day. In this story, Noda answered no to question 27, qualifying that before he would serve in the US military, he and his family should first be given their freedom. Consequently, Noda and his family were sent to Tule Lake Segregation Prison. And in anger, Noda renounced his American citizenship. Ozawa answered yes and volunteered for military intelligence service to become an interpreter and a spy during the war. At the end of the war, Noda lives with the embittered sense of betrayal, while Ozawa returns from the terror of the war, but can never reveal his secret work for American military intelligence. And this silence plays out in the rebellion of their Sansei children. Now, persuasion, as far as I'm concerned, is a pun. In the 60s, there was a singing group called the Asian Persuasions, and they sang, dressed, and danced their routines like Smokey Robinson. Now, they could have been these guys, and okay, in the day, they were much younger looking, but hey, they're still pretty cute. Or they could be these guys. I don't know, but you choose. My guess is this guy would be my guy. The Elliott family, in my persuasion, is the Kiku Katana family. No such Japanese surname exists, at least I don't think so. In 1946, as the war ended, anthropologist Ruth Benedict published the book Chrysanthemum and the Sword, Patterns of Japanese Culture, in which she compared the contradictions in Japanese society to the cultivated beauty of the chrysanthemum and the bloody violence of the sword. Chrysanthemum in Japanese is kiku, and sword is katana, therefore kiku katana. I interpreted the patriarch in Jane Austen's novel, Sir Walter Elliot, to be pretentiously covetous of his status as a baronet. Kiku katana is my way of playing with the contradictions and pretensions that Benedict supposedly uncovered in Japanese culture. Oh, one more thing. These are the girls. My mother is seated to the right. These ladies were known to my family as the girls. They were a group of unmarried aunties who always got together, and I imagined any three of them as moving in to raise the heroine of persuasion, Anne, when her mother died. Mrs. Aka convened the girls. She called Mrs. Nendo, who called Mrs. Equibo, and they all met at Marie Callender's for lunch. Mrs. Aka squeezed the sliver of lemon and stirred 2 lumps of sugar into her iced tea. We have, shall I say, a situation. Mrs. Nendo looked over her bifocals, querying, situation? Then back to the menu. Oh, I can't decide, pot pie or pot roast? Michi, pot pie, you always do the pot pie, observed Mrs. Equable. Girls, Mrs. Aka interrupted, we have a situation. Her eyes drilled into her soul sisters as if this could be the Bay of Pigs. The last of Austen's novels is Lady Susan, although I assume it was written first. My version of Lady Susan is entitled Omaki-san. In writing this story, I researched the writing of Ichio Higuchi. Higuchi can perhaps be considered the Jane Austen of Japan, and her image is on the 5,000 yen bill. She lived from 1812 to 1896 during the transition of the Edo period to the Meiji and the opening of Japan. Ichio Higuchi wrote this beautiful story, Take Kurabe, known in English as Growing Up or Child's Play. It is the story of children coming of age in the late Edo period in Tokyo. One of the characters is named Omaki. My story is set in the post-war years, when a young Nisei doctor, James Yamazaki, went to Nagasaki to work with victims of the atomic bomb. He wrote his memoir in this book, Children of the Atomic Bomb. The story I've written has been created around the memory of this history, that encounter with Japan, both motherland and foreign country, involving Nisei doctors like James Yamazaki, and many other Nisei interpreters and intelligence officers who work for the occupation in post-war Japan. As you know, Lady Susan is written in what we know of as the first form of the novel, the epistolary, that is, letters, correspondence between characters. Similarly, my Omaki-san is written as epistolary. In this case, the letters are exchanged between Los Angeles and Nagasaki during post-war Japan. And I suppose you have to be able to read Japanese to know what is really happening. True intentions lie in the language and to whom the letters are written. Finally, I'd like to acknowledge my friend, the poet and translator, Keijiro Suga, who translated Omaki and Otsuma's letters into Japanese. Mukashi Mukashi, the war came with planes that dropped bombs and destroyed everything. Not that the planes were anonymous, nor were the men who piloted them, but from that distance in the sky, who could know where exactly the bombs fell? Would it have been different had the eyes of the child who pointed upward and those of the bombardier met? In this assumed indifference, many people died, but there were those who crawled away from the rubble and found a way to survive. So there you have it. The story of how I came to know and appreciate Jane Austen, but also how, in some form or another, all the heroines and heroes in Austen's novels could be, well, it could be Sansei. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Karen. That was wonderful. Yeah, if you'll stop screen sharing, we'll be able to see you better. Okay, fantastic. So we do have a few questions. First, a couple of comments. People were saying how much they loved all the illustrations. Those are incredible, really, really fun. And also the historical connections that you made, where a lot of people have commented about that and how rewarding that was, how fascinating and enlightening that was. One quick question was, does the Atomic Cafe still exist?
No, it was torn down. There is a film that was made about it. There was a film that was made out of it by I think his name is Tak Nakamura. And so you can see the documentary if you'd like.
Oh, that's wonderful. Another question was about some of the inspiration. Were you inspired by some of the, over the last several years, like the Muslim ban and some of the other kind of stoking of racial hatred, really? How did that affect some of the things you were writing about?
Yes, it did. Well, let's see. Now, in the period that I was writing this, it may have been earlier, but as the book was being published, I realized that there was greater significance of the writing. And I always, now I have this sense that things have been better, but it's been very disappointing. And so I see that my writing is necessary.
It's like, it strikes me, Jane Austen is so timeless, and sadly, some of the things you're writing about, some of these issues are still timeless. We're still dealing with these issues decades later, and it's disappointing, but there is something about that, like the human nature that you're writing about, and that Jane Austen wrote about. That's, I think, really striking. Another question was, what was your sister's reaction to your conversion to Jane Austen?
I think you have to ask her.
Jane, you want to respond to that? We'll give Jane a sec. Jane, if you want to come on, let's see. For those of you who haven't picked up the book yet, it's wonderful in the Lady Susan, I'm gonna, Omaki-san. You'll see I don't know if you can see this, but so that you have the original letter and then the translation. It's kind of wonderful. Let's see. Jane, are you there? Do you want to answer the question?
I was really well, thrilled and flattered that my sister was going to make a whole book out of Jane Austen. I was amazed that she was going to do that, but she persevered, and it's great. And so we're all very happy. And then this was a family effort.
I think she's more relieved. I just had the feeling that she didn't want me to do this. And I know that as I wrote each story, I gave them to you. There was silence. Silence is not a good, that's not, but yeah.
Yeah, relief. Yeah. All worked out.
I think we're also wondering, have people reached out to who've read this? Have they had that reaction to? There's so many people commenting about just that, it's so universal. The feeling of being outside and not being understood by the society that you are in, and have you gotten a lot of feedback from readers about that?
I have not. I don't know that. Yeah, I don't necessarily have. I've seen reviews, but I've not necessarily had feedback.
We have a couple more questions. Here's a question from Nikki. From what I understand, some Japanese in particular, the ones settled on the East Coast, were not interned in camps. If so, does that create any type of division in the Japanese American community? Feelings of resentment or misunderstanding from one, experience to the other during the war?
There may be some understanding, but no, I don't feel that that's the misunderstanding that we have of those who were in camp or not. I think the misunderstandings come from that questionnaire that I mentioned, question 27 and 28. Those decisions by Japanese Americans in camp to that loyalty questionnaire has been very divisive. Because a number of people were forced to lose their citizenship for a period of time because of that. And some were also deported. They returned to Japan, or if they were Nisei, they had never been to Japan, and they had to live in Japan in the post-war in a Japan that had been devastated by war. And it took many years for them to regain their citizenship. And all of this was a secret. It was it wasn't really spoken among Japanese. And you realize now how hurtful that was.
Absolutely. One person's commented that they would love to see a Netflix series of your book. It would be a wonderful series. Do you know, another question is, do you know if Jane Austen is read and appreciated very much in Japan? I know there's a Jane Austen Society in Japan. Do you have any other insight on how she's received there?
I believe she is. I believe there are many readers, especially Although Anna Green Gables is probably wins out among Japanese, I have this feeling.
Let's see, another question. Some people think of Austen as decorous and sweet, but there's a lot of anger under the polite surface. Were you surprised at that aspect of Austen when you started reading that? Your stories pick that up so beautifully.
Yes, it was. Well, maybe not, because I'd seen with my sister the movies I think I was surprised. She's got a great tongue, and I think that's why so many writers enjoy her work.
A question about the first part of your book, how it relates to the second part, the Jane Austen stories. Do you consider them entirely separate? And also, can you explain your inspiration for The Bath?
I don't think they're entirely separate. And I chose among my short stories those that had to do with growing up as a Sansei, or at least becoming old, my generation. So I was particularly aware of the stories that I would choose. But I'm also amazed, or I'm also, I don't know if I'm amazed, but I'm also, as I read the stories I wrote in the Jane Austen section, what surprised me was the way they resonate back and forth. For instance, the two sisters, and then of course the Bath is the two sisters. And the Bath was something I wrote, was probably the first story ever published. So
how long did it take you to work on this piece? I mean, this book, Sansei and Sensibility.
Well, the first half of the book was already written. They were pieces I had published in scattered journals and places before. As for the Austen section, I'm not sure. Maybe over a period of a year I was reading, and then it always takes longer for a book to be published. So I don't know exactly when I finished all 7 stories, but I went at it one at a time over maybe a period of a year or two.
Well, someone's mentioning that there's an Anne of Green Gables anime, so just to attest to the popularity. Another question: what was the time frame of? Oh, I just asked this. Let's see. How long did it take you from reading Austen through writing the story? So, when did you first come to start reading Austen?
It's been several years. I don't know. I can't tell you. Yeah. And also, my eyes are not well, so I do a lot of audio listening. So I listen to all of the novels on audiobooks as well, and then I would go back to the book and to check the text. But I listen to all of them.
And you said, I think, that Emma was your favorite read. Is there one that also your favorite work of Austen?
I think Emma might be my favorite. I don't know. I loved her character and the development of the character over time, and also I enjoyed Austen's inserts of her. It's she gets in there and she tells you what she thinks about what's going on, and I appreciated that.
It's fascinating that. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah,
please. I didn't mean to cut you off. Go ahead.
No, it's fine. And she also does that in Persuasion as well. She's at the beginning. Her opinion is quite evident, or at least I think so. As a narrator.
Yeah, it was fascinating that you had her be unaware that she had been in an internment camp. That was really for Emma, because she is naive in the novel, and it's a wonderful, just the imagination that you used in all of the pieces and how you translated them was really quite fascinating. Another person is asking about the cover of the book, which they love, we all love, but can you talk a little bit about that and how that came to be?
All right, I think, and she's here, I think Ruth, my friend Ruth, found those, that series of photos. And so we sent that to the publisher and suggested it. And the publisher loved that series of photography. And yeah, I actually wanted my sister to be on the front of the book. That idea was mixed.
Okay, we have another really interesting question. Agreeing that your work is really necessary, what do you hope comes out of it now, and who do you hope reads it now?
Well, it's interesting to see that because it's attached to Jane Austen, that I suddenly have a wider readership. And I'm very grateful to that, but I didn't intend that. I was really writing these stories for my sister. And so I'm so pleased to see all of you here and interested in my work. And also it's, I mean, I also watch Bridgerton, I guess as you all have. And so I'm amused to see that there is an interest in placing race and the context of Austen's, that period in time, into a kind of context that's also present. And yeah, I'm pleased to see that, and I'm also interested to see how perhaps more writers can become involved in thinking about that period, and what it means for us today.
Right. Another person's asking what you're working on next. Do you have any other project in the works?
Right now, I'm working on that. Those questions, question 27 and 28 of the loyalty questionnaire. And I'm particularly interested in where those questions came from. And maybe, so I'm researching that, but I'm thinking about where those questions came from in the sense of historically and philosophically. So what is loyalty? And how do we think of it, and how do we treat people because of their loyalty, what we think their loyalty should be, and also how that has been interpreted. So I think that I put up there Ruth Benedict, and I think she's consequential as an anthropologist in defining Japanese loyalty. And I think that has had consequences for the Japanese American community and also the occupation of Japan. So that's what I'm working on right now.
Yeah, absolutely. Another person asked if you had read more of Austen's juvenilia besides Lady Susan, and if so, how did you respond to it?
I have not. I have not. But I'm told that that it's interesting. I should. The project has stopped.
Does anybody have a question that I missed? Let's see.
I've got a comment, if I might, or
sure, Jeannie.
A question. Karen, this was a delight. I really enjoyed reading these stories. Probably helped that I grew up in Los Angeles right about the time you were, except I was on the west side in Westchester, but I could really relate to so much of this. And I just thought it was so cleverly done. And I loved how you gave the Kathy character, her home was in Fullerton, which is
Yeah.
that's the name of her town in the book, and things like that. And having a goth situation, you had to make it a little bit later into the 70s rather than the 60s
Yes.
to make that work. But that was just really, really clever. And I did love the gender switch or the role switch in Monterey Park, and which is another great classic LA place name that you use so well. One question was to make that work, to make Monterey Park work and that gender switch. Did you feel you had to make that that family Chinese Japanese, and the mother in particular Chinese as the tiger mom? Because I was wondering about that. I thought this was about the Japanese Americans. So could you talk about that just a little bit?
Yeah, well, as you can see, I'm making fun of Amy Chua and her Tiger Mothers, her memoir, and so that's yes, I did feel that I had to use the Chinese, and also the Chinese community moved to Monterey Park, so they are there. So yeah, I it works, I guess. I don't know so many Japanese American mothers who are tiger mothers, but yeah, my Chinese American friends will tell you about their mothers.
Does anybody else have a question they haven't asked, or any other
Yes,
comments?
I do.
Go
Jan.
ahead, Jan. Go ahead, Jan.
Hi, Karen. What books did you read as a young person that inspired you to become a writer?
Oh, what books did I read? Oh, yeah, well, when I was a kid, I was reading Nancy Drew. That's true. But my sister was reading 007. She was, and so you can see what that's all about. And then I think later on, I was an English major in college, so but for some reason I never read Jane Austen. I read all the old white guys, probably in the day. But Mark Twain, Melville, I love Moby Dick. So Moby Dick might be, I'm more, let's see, not as much Hawthorne. I didn't care for him as so much, but okay, the Southern writers. Okay, I can't.
Faulkner.
Yeah, Southern authors.
Flannery O'Connor.
Yes. So I really loved them. And then later on, I started to read the Latin American authors, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, Luis Borges, and fell in love with them. And then I've also read quite a few of in those days, I read Japanese authors in translation, Mishima, Kawabata. Yeah. And then gradually, the Japanese American, Asian American writers who have come through and who are writing now, they're fabulous.
That's true.
Do you have a favorite among those?
Chang Rei Lee, for short. Chang Rei Lee is a wonderful writer. Jessica Hagedorn. I can name more.
Go ahead. We all are always looking for new authors to discover. So
Seshu Foster has a new book out, and I'm reading it now. My friend Garrett Hongo is a poet. Maybe he's there. Garrett, hi.
he is.
Yes, he's wonderful, wonderful writer. Yeah.
Right. Okay, everyone, we have so many wonderful comments in the chat. I think this has been so inspiring. Anybody else have a question that you would like to ask or a comment?
I do.
Yes, I have a question. Did you consider writing a chapter on Sanditon?
Oh, no, no. I guess I have to read it. I don't know it.
I think you should read it. It would be an interesting chapter in your book.
All right, I'll work at it. I'll talk to my sister.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Karen. Okay, one last chance. Anybody else have a burning question or comment?
Can I just say, I love your stories, and Jane sent me your book and I love it. I've been reading the short stories. Hey, Jane, thank you so much for the summer readings and this year in quarantine, being able to enjoy your short stories. I feel like I really admire your relationship as sisters. I don't have a sister, but if I had one, I think I would enjoy having you as a sister.
Yeah, Jane Tomei is the best sister. She's wonderful.
The two of you are quite an impressive pair, I have to say. So we're so grateful that Jane brought you to us and that you were willing to come and speak to us today, because it was just absolutely a wonderful talk. Thank you so much, Karen. And so everybody, we will have the video will be up later today. We'll have the chat also available. So because there are a lot of wonderful comments and ideas in the chat as well. So that will be shared with everyone. And
I
so
still
nice.
have a question.
Please go ahead.
Yes, I wondered if you ever thought about in Sense and Sensibility, you seem to be very close to your sister, but you seem to have very different personalities from what I get by this talk. And I was wondering if you ever thought of yourselves as the Dashwood sisters, Marianne and Eleanor. And who's who?
It's probably true. That's probably us. I mean, I probably downloaded Eleanor and Marianne in that story, and in the story, my sister is Marianne.
That's what I thought.
But she'd be upset if she.
Well.
She doesn't like that. Or maybe I'm Marianne and she's Eleanor. That's the other way. Yeah, she would probably say to me, get a grip. It's stop moping around, get a grip, move on. Shikatanai. That would probably, it's the other way around, she'd say. But I thought I was the older person in the story. That's really funny. The other thing about that story is that I wanted to create an Oriental space. So it's an Orientalized version of our Sansei lives. It's also a satire of itself. So that's when I read that section to you about the Japanese garden and running around in kimono. And that was just, that never happened, of course. Yeah.
Sorry about that. Hang on. Okay, we have one more question. So sorry about that. Oh, technology. Is there a history of Japanese American Los Angeles that anyone is aware of that would be wonderful for people to read?
I don't know. Is it? Yeah, someone can tell me, maybe.
The museum, the Little Tokyo Museum, the Japanese American National Museum, has a great history of all that stuff. And I went on a tour once with a friend of Little Tokyo. I think it was from the museum, and that was great.
And someone also has listed in the chat a little resource here from KCET. And also from the LA Conservancy. So again, I'll make that available to everybody as well. And someone also asked if there'd be a list of some of the books that were mentioned here, and we'll try to put that together as well. Great.
Thank you. Thank you.
A good book about those two questions, 27 and 28, is a No Boy as well.
Oh, yes, yes.
Great. Wonderful. Karen, thank you so much. Again, also thank you, Jane. Karen, this has just been, people are commenting this is like one of the most enjoyable days and also presentations that we've seen. And we really are so grateful for you to take the time to prepare this and to share this with us and for your wonderful book. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Susie, and thank you, everyone. I'm very honored to be here. I never thought that this would ever happen. So thank you all.
Thank you, Karen. All right. Thanks, everybody. Take care. We'll see you again soon. All right.
Thank
Take
you.
care.
Bye, Professor.
Bye. Everybody wave bye. Bye. It's great to see everyone. Thank you all for coming.